The moment was heavy, charged with tension that seemed to pull the air tight around them. The battlefield, which moments before had echoed with the distant thunder of footsteps and the sharp clink of weapons, fell into a profound stillness. Time did not stop, but it slowed just enough for everything else to fade away except for that one shared look. It wasn't just a glance of recognition. It was something ancient and raw. Something that whispered across generations, cultures, and the hardened stories passed down through blood-soaked history. It was never meant to happen this way. The world had long written their roles in black and white, one side good, the other evil, one right, the other wrong. Everything they had been taught was simple, unquestioned, absolute. But reality rarely obeys the rules set by the past. When their eyes met, the illusion cracked. There was no rage, no scream, no final strike, just stillness. And in that stillness, a flood of emotions no language could capture. There was pain unmistakable and raw. Not the kind born of wounds in battle, but of loneliness, of loss, of the crushing weight of a lifetime spent being shaped into a weapon. Both carried scars not visible to the eye, and in that one look, those scars were laid bare. What was supposed to be a moment of conquest turned into a mirror, each seeing the suffering reflected in the other. Empathy began where hatred once lived. Neither had asked for this war. They had been born into it, molded by it, taught to hate before they even knew what hate was. But hate did not survive the truth that was revealed in silence. The truth that beyond bloodlines, beyond uniform and legacy, there existed something far more powerful: understanding. That understanding didn't need words. It didn't need apologies or explanations. It simply lived in that moment, raw and undeniable. It was a challenge to everything they had ever believed. One stare, and suddenly the stories they'd clung to for survival seemed hollow. It asked the impossible: what if everything had been a lie? What if the real enemy wasn't standing in front of them, but somewhere behind, manipulating both sides like pieces on a board? That single eye contact did more damage to the war than 1,000 weapons ever could. Because once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. A silent agreement formed between two souls that were supposed to be enemies. There was no handshake, no truce declared aloud. But something shifted. No one else might have noticed it, but the weight of that exchange would ripple out in waves far beyond the battlefield. One moment of eye contact, and the lines were redrawn not on maps or in treaties, but deep within hearts. What followed may have looked the same from the outside. The clash of swords, the roar of battle, the commands shouted across ranks. But something had changed. A seed was planted. And while others fought with fury, these two carried something different within them. A question, a flicker of hope, a memory of a moment when everything was still and real. When the armor cracked and what was underneath finally breathed free. Hatred had been passed down like an heirloom, quietly, persistently, and without question. From childhood stories to ancient songs, the narrative had always been the same: a fierce rivalry forged in blood, carved into history like scripture. The divide was not just political or geographical. It was emotional, spiritual, generational. There were no exceptions, no middle ground. One was either loyal or a traitor. One either stood with a legacy or was swallowed by shame. And in the shadow of this deeply embedded history, war was inevitable. But then, there was a moment. A moment that defied centuries of division and expectation. A moment so subtle and unplanned, yet so profound that it threatened to unravel the entire foundation of inherited hatred. No words were exchanged. There was no negotiation, no dramatic declaration. Only a look unexpected, unguarded, and devastating in its honesty. that look didn't just meet the eyes. It pierced deeper into memories, into fears, into truths. Long buried beneath armor and anger. The pain reflected in that gaze wasn't the kind born of a single loss, it was layered. It spoke of generations torn apart, of mothers grieving sons they never truly knew, of children raised on stories of vengeance instead of hope. It carried the sorrow of choices made under pressure, of silence maintained out of duty, and of a longing for peace that was too dangerous to voice. Everything that had ever been hidden was suddenly exposed in the span of a few seconds. There had always been a belief that the other side was soulless, monstrous, unworthy of compassion, but that illusion crumbled in that shared silence. There was nothing monstrous in the eyes now locked in connection, only exhaustion, confusion, and a quiet plea for something different. In that instant, the narrative began to shift. No longer a tale of heroes versus villains, but of people, just people who had been taught to fear and destroy each other without ever understanding why. And yet, even in that moment of connection, fear lingered. Fear of betrayal, of being seen as weak, of going against everything that had been drilled into the bones since birth. But alongside the fear was something far more powerful: recognition. A recognition that the enemy was not so different, that the pain, the loss, the longing, they were mutual. The shared burden of endless conflict had left them both hollow, and for the first time, that hollowness echoed in unity. The silence was louder than any war cry. It said what neither dared to speak aloud, that this wasn't what they wanted. That perhaps they had never truly wanted any of this. That beneath all the fury and vengeance was a quiet desperation for something else, a different ending. A future not shaped by the past's cruelty, but by the possibility of healing. The weight of that possibility pressed down like gravity, and yet, it offered a strange kind of lightness. Others around them could not see the depth of that exchange. To the outside world, the battle continued. Steel clashed. Dust rose. Commands were barked. But for those two souls locked in that moment of clarity, everything was different now. The war didn't make sense anymore, not in the way it used to. Not after realizing the humanity in what was once demonized. Not after recognizing the eyes of a survivor, a fighter, a mourner, just like themselves. That recognition would not be undone. It would linger like a shadow, like a whispered truth too dangerous to speak, but too powerful to forget. Even if the battle went on, even if orders were followed and masks put back on, that seed of awareness had been planted. And once planted, it grew. Quietly, relentlessly, in dreams and memories, in the quiet spaces between violence and duty. It grew into doubt, into reflection, into silent resistance. The world might never know the moment that passed between them. The look that altered the course of two legacies. But for those who witnessed it, who truly felt it, everything changed. The lines blurred, the stories shifted. And for the first time, the idea of peace didn't feel like a betrayal, it felt like the only truth left. The battlefield had always been a place of absolutes, of commands followed, of enemies marked by symbols, and of loyalty tested under fire. Every step forward had been taken with certainty, with the weight of generations behind it, guiding the blade and sharpening the purpose. But in the thick of chaos, something unexplainable occurred. It wasn't a clash of steel or a triumphant charge. It was quiet, almost invisible to those watching. A moment that lasted mere seconds but shattered years of conviction. What took place in that instant was not about strategy or strength. It was about something deeper, something ancient yet rarely acknowledged. A truth buried under armor, beneath layers of indoctrination and pain. It came not with the roar of war, but with a glance, a pause, A hesitation. A moment when eyes met and for the first time saw not a rival but a mirror. A reflection of shared suffering, of dreams torn apart, of identities manipulated by causes. Too vast to question. Asterisk. The stories passed down had always spoken of duty of honor found in fighting, in never yielding, in dying with pride. But what if those stories were never meant to be the whole truth? What if they were incomplete, sculpted to serve agendas, to maintain a cycle that fed on sacrifice? That single moment of eye contact cracked open that possibility. It didn't erase the pain or the years lost, but it challenged the very foundation of loyalty and belief. Asterisk, there was no enemy in that gaze, only confusion, exhaustion, and something profoundly human. A flicker of sorrow. A trace of longing for something beyond survival and obedience. It was as if the weight of lineage and legacy melted for just a heartbeat, allowing something more vulnerable to emerge. Something that didn't scream or fight, but simply asked, why? Why had this bloodshed been allowed to define them? Why had their stories been reduced to conflict when so much more was possible? Asterisk, the moment didn't bring immediate answers. It brought questions. Difficult ones. Ones that could not be asked aloud without consequences. But they echoed internally, louder than any war cry. Was loyalty still loyalty if it required the blind destruction of someone equally broken? Was pride still pride if it silenced empathy? The gaze exchanged in that fleeting silence held those questions and more. It invited discomfort. It invited truth. Asterisk, and within that discomfort came clarity. A realization that the war was not only fought with weapons, but with ideas implanted to control, to divide, to erase the nuance of human experience. The true battleground was the heart, the conscience, the ability to feel in a world that demanded numbness. And in that moment, feeling returned. Not as a weakness, but as the strongest resistance of all. Asterisk, no orders were disobeyed. No dramatic act of rebellion unfolded immediately, but something shifted. A boundary, once ironclad, had softened. The world had drawn a line between us and them, right and wrong, loyal and traitor. But that look had erased that line, even if just for a breath. And in doing so, it changed everything. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't surrender. It was understanding. Understanding is dangerous in war. It makes it harder to dehumanize, harder to strike, harder to obey without question. It brings faces. To the faceless, pain to the silent, and depth to the simplified. It makes you remember that before the uniform, before the cause, there was a person. A child. A soul shaped by forces beyond control. And suddenly, the role played for so long no longer fits the same. Asterisk, from that day on, nothing could be seen through the same lens again. Each encounter, each decision, each memory bore the imprint of that one moment. And even if the war continued, even if duty demanded more, the knowledge gained in that silence could never be stripped away. It became a quiet rebellion. A seed of truth growing in the cracks of a long-standing lie. Not loud, not violent, but undeniable. Asterisk, sometimes the most powerful acts are not those that defy orders or destroy enemies, but those that rediscover the humanity beneath it all. In the eyes once considered hostile, a different tale was glimpsed, a tale not of conquest, but of connection. And that tale, though spoken only in silence, would live on far longer than the war itself. Asterisk. The clash was expected. The buildup had been long, fueled by decades of conflict, betrayal, and the constant drumbeat of vengeance. Everything led to this moment, strategies mapped, allegiances drawn, and emotions honed into sharp weapons. The battlefield had been prepared with precision, and the outcome seemed predetermined. But then came a pause, a hesitation. A flicker in time that no one had anticipated. All it took was a look, an unguarded, soul-deep glance that changed the course of everything that followed. That moment was not part of the plan. It was raw, unscripted, deeply human. Amidst the chaos of war, a different kind of battle unfolded, one not of fists or blades, but of internal conflict, identity, and awakening. A gaze connected not just two opponents, but two souls equally, burdened by a war they never chose. What was supposed to be an act of domination became something far more complex. The look didn't ignite fury, it sparked recognition. It was the recognition of pain. Not the kind visible in wounds and scars, but the quiet kind that lives in silence. The ache of being used as a tool, of carrying expectations that don't match the person inside, of being told who to hate and who to be without ever being asked. That pain was mirrored in that glance. And in that mirror, a truth emerged that no blade could cut through. They were not so different after all. The stories they were raised on had painted clear roles: hero versus villain, right versus wrong, protector versus invader. But those stories had always been told from a distance, carefully shaped to fit a narrative. In the heat of battle, that distance vanished. There was no myth to hide behind, no anthem loud enough to drown the feeling rising from within. And that feeling whispered something dangerous. What if the enemy wasn't evil, but wounded? What if this war had stolen from them both? The glance shared in that instant did not erase years of pain, but it questioned their purpose. It cracked the foundation beneath a life built on obedience and fear. It introduced the possibility that everything done in the name of duty might have been born from lies, that the legacy of violence passed down from one generation to the next was not honor, but a cycle that needed to be broken. And it was not just about survival. That moment revealed something beyond instinct, beyond politics, beyond pride. It was about choice. The freedom to see, to feel, to decide. Not based on the expectations of ancestors or the pressure of commands, but from the heart. That one look brought forth a flood of buried truths. It stripped away the armor of hate, revealing the vulnerability that had long been hidden beneath. In that space between violence and vulnerability, something sacred happened. Not a truce, not a surrender, just an acknowledgement. An understanding that beneath the titles, beneath the histories, were two beings molded by sorrow, striving to protect what they loved and questioning what they were told. And in that silent acknowledgement, the world shifted. From the outside, nothing had changed. The war raged on. Dust and smoke still filled the air. But inside, within the soul that held that gaze, a transformation began. The battle continued, but no longer with the same certainty. Each movement became a question. Each act of aggression carried a shadow of doubt. And that doubt became a guide not to destruction, but to truth. The memory of that moment could not be erased. It lived in every heartbeat, in every breath taken afterward. It lived in the quiet when the world slept, in the spaces between orders, in the ache behind the eyes. It became a silent promise to never again forget what was seen, what was felt. To hold on to that glimpse of shared humanity as a shield against the darkness. In a world that demanded blind loyalty, that moment was a quiet rebellion. A rebellion not of defiance, but of awakening. It planted the seed of change, not in speeches or protests, but in a single glance that dared to see beyond the mask of war. And once that seed was planted, it grew with every breath, every heartbeat. Every step taken in the name of something greater than hatred. Sometimes, the loudest turning points come not from battle cries or explosions, but from silence, from moments that slip between the noise and force us to feel something deeper. In the eyes of an enemy, truth can shine brighter than any weapon. Not the kind of truth found in books or banners, but the kind buried inside truth that hurts, heals, and awakens. When centuries of hatred meet a single moment of empathy, the world tilts just enough for change to begin. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply is. Asterisk. These moments don't rewrite history in an instant, but they plant something powerful in the hearts that experience them. Doubt, yes, but also courage. Courage to question. Courage to see the other not as a target, but as a story. And in that story, a reflection of pain, of sacrifice, of longing for peace in a world addicted to war. The idea that behind the armor and training, behind the loyalty and fear, exists someone equally human, equally broken, equally capable of love. Asterisk, that is the revolution. Not one of weapons, but of understanding. Not one that marches, but one that lingers quietly in the soul and waits for the right moment to bloom. It may take time, years, generations, even. But once the spark of empathy is lit, it spreads in invisible ways, through gestures, through choices, through the refusal to see only in black and white. Asterisk, this isn't a fairy tale. The war doesn't end in a blink. Scars remain, wounds run deep, and the noise continues. But within it, something has shifted. A seed of transformation now lives where once there was only rage. And that seed, no matter how small, carries the power to change everything. Because once you've looked into the eyes of the one you were told to hate and saw something familiar, you can never go back. Asterisk, that moment lives on. Not in monuments or medals, but in the silence after the storm. In the quiet heartbeat of someone who chooses to see instead of strike, who chooses to feel instead of follow. And in that choice, humanity wins one glance, one soul, one story at a time. Asterisk.